We continue in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, just as a review, this is our third session, and we have introduced the book, answered some big questions about it, pointed out phrases to watch for, themes to watch for, especially the repetition of phrases, things of that nature, who wrote it, when was it written, covered all that in our first session. So if you haven't seen that, it's a good idea to go back and see it. Then in our second session, we looked at the beginning, the introduction, so to speak, or some people might call it the epilogue. No, it would not be the epilogue. That's ridiculous. The prologue to the book, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, which is written in a different voice than the main body of the book itself. So we examined that and looked at some of the big overall meanings, the thoughts for what that is in Ecclesiastes. What's the purpose of the book? What's its message? And today we are going to look at chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. So we're going to finish chapter 1. Now, just as a review, so we've got this main character. Most English translations choose between the teacher or the preacher. Where, if we refer to him in English, going to call him the preacher. Of course, the Hebrew word is Qoheleth or Qoheleth, and I will use that a lot because most of the commentators will just use Qoheleth as a Hebrew loan word, not try to translate it because it has such a wide range of meaning. It's hard to just pin it down to one good, certain, solid English translation. So, who is the preacher? Well, the text wants us to believe that it's Solomon. It's kind of using the Solomon persona, if you will, as a literary device. Now, the traditional view is that it was Solomon, but it wants us to think it's Solomon. And of course, whether it was or was not Solomon does not affect the inspiration of Ecclesiastes itself. It does not affect, does it belong in the canon or not. It doesn't affect anything of that nature. So you're fine thinking either way. I think we're using the Solomon persona. We're writing in a Solomonic way or idiom. What's the structure? We see that it's hard to make an outline of Ecclesiastes. If you actually tried that, I suggested that you did. If you actually did that, well done. You probably have a headache or had a headache, and I'm very sorry about that. But it does have a main structure, and that is verses 1 through 11, and then verses 12, 8 through 14 serve as like an introduction and a conclusion in a different voice, in third person. And then chapter 1, verse 12, all the way through chapter 12, verse 7, is written in first person. So the preacher, Qoheleth, is speaking to us himself, so to speak. And so that's the structure. And then we saw in the beginning that we get in verse 1 of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, we get this introduction of the character of Qoheleth. We get the theme of the book in verses 2 and 3, and we get the mood in verses 4 through 11. And Derek Kidner used this great imagery of a treadmill, right? Which I call the dreadmill. A lot of runners do that. The treadmill. You exert all this effort, but you never get anywhere. You never see anything new. You're just stuck in the same place. So now we pick up. And in verses 12 through 18 is what we're going to look at. So hopefully you've got your Bible with you and you're going to read along with us. When I read the text, I'll be reading out of the ESV. Please choose whichever translation you are comfortable with. Before we read in this, just a reminder that the main message of Ecclesiastes is that it's an apologetic, it's a defense of that a life of faith in a generous God is is the only one that really makes sense, because our author is pointing out the grimness of the alternative. If we remove God from the equation and we just talk about life under the sun, under heaven, what are we left with? And so it's using the wisdom, the teachings of Qoheleth as a foil to say, hey, the life of faith in God, in Yahweh, that's where we want to go. But now we're going to hear from Qoheleth himself. So he has been talked about, but now picking up in chapter 1, verse 12, we're hearing from him in first person. So, reading, he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness, and to know folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Happy text, right? You were warned, okay? You were warned. So we see here that the exploration, the investigation into life under the sun has begun. This serves as kind of an introduction to that investigation. Honestly, I think that there needs to be, the chapter break should have been after verse 11, and that verse 12 should have begun a new chapter, because you'll see that going into chapter 2, actually it's the same kind of speech is being continued. Chapter 2 kind of starts in an arbitrary place. Remember, when this was written, it was not written with its verse numbers and chapter numbers. Those came later as reference points, so we can find things easily. So we don't always need to just assume that where the chapter is, there's a break in thought, or a break in argument, or a break in a speech. A lot of times there is, but not all the time. This is one of those instances where it'd be helpful if it was changed up. But I digress. This is what we have just read. And looking in verse 12, we go back. He says, I, the preacher, this is Qoheleth, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So we have this introduction. And it's, again, we are introducing the persona of Solomon. And why? Why do this? It's so that we can believe that Qoheleth can actually perform the exploration and the investigation that he devises. So he says, I'm going to do all this exploration. I'm going to do this investigating. Well, Solomon, who was super rich and super wise and had a bunch of leisure time, could actually perform this kind of investigation. And so that's why the Solomon persona is being evoked. And many scholars believe that it's obvious that the author wants us to think, oh, Solomon as a literary device, not as in literally Solomon, but as in like, oh, I get what you're doing, like this helps it make sense. This helps it make sense. And again, it's saying, hey, there's going to be an exhaustive exploration of life, wisdom, pleasure, folly, toil under the sun. And so that's when we get into verse 13 here. Qoheleth is saying, I applied my heart. This is a diligent and earnest search. He's not like a detached spectator. He's not kind of sitting back and going, well, I kind of stayed on the sidelines and observe some things. No, he's in the midst of it. He's in the middle. He is intent on this, and so he's applying all of not only his faculties, but also his passion to this search, to this investigation. And in verse 13, we see, he says, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He sees the futility of life, and he highlights that, meaning that people want purpose, right? But meaning under heaven, which is synonymous with under the sun. Under heaven, under the sun, they mean the same thing. And actually, in some copies of Ecclesiastes, the scribes, when they are copying it out, replaced under heaven with under the sun. And it means the same thing because under the sun is repeated so many times in the book. But under heaven, it's just synonymous with that. So again, the parameters have been defined for us. We're thinking horizontally here. Now, what does he mean by it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with? And some translators say you could even, instead of unhappy might be a little light there, you could say evil. That it's bad. It's a bad lot that we have been cast. What's the meaning here? And some scholars connect the thought here in verse 13 to something that Paul writes in his letter to the church in Rome. So in Romans 8, which is renowned for its quotable verses, right? We get this section that we don't normally quote because, we have verses like, now there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We have verses about how our spirit can cry out to God as our Abba. We have verses about how nothing can separate us from God's love. But in Romans 8, 19 through 23, Paul writes this, and I'm going to take a drink of water before I read it. That gives you time to flip there. Romans 8, 19 through 23. All right. So reading, it says, Paul writes this, for creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, Christians. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, that's God, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Boiling it all down, Paul is saying, look, creation is groaning for the culmination of salvation, for everything to be made new, be made right again, because it is subjected to futility. And we, as humans, are doing the exact same thing. We understand that life under the sun is futile, that if we are just looking at it from that perspective, man, there is just, it's the dreadmill. It's toil, what's the purpose? What's the meaning? What do we actually gain? Is there anything new? We see the problems, but we can't find the solutions. And so some New Testament scholars think that Paul, in this section of Romans, is alluding to Ecclesiastes, especially with that word that's translated futility, because since that is a huge theme in Ecclesiastes. And so that's what it means that back in Ecclesiastes, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Now, I want to read actually the NIV translation of these verses. Now that we've talked about kind of this mood here that Qoheleth is bringing up, because I think the NIV, it really captures the mood and the meaning very, very well. So listen, he says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. You really get the mood. I think the meaning is really brought to the surface here. So especially since, we're digging into verse 13, I think it's helpful for us to hear the NIV's rendition of this section, chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. Now, as we move on to verse 14, it says, I have seen everything that is done under the sun. Behold, all is vanity, striving after the wind. It's the ambition for what is unattainable. It's saying, man, if we could just do this, if we could just get here, if we could just accomplish this, if we could just fix this, but knowing that you never will be able to, a hamster on a wheel, right? You never go anywhere. And of course, this under the sun, it sets the parameters. Okay, we're just looking from a purely horizontal perspective. We're talking about the material world. We are not bringing God or heaven or faith into the equation at all. So then in verse 15, we get a proverb. Here, this section, passage of verses can be separated into two sections. So you have verses 12 through 14, and then verse 15 is a proverb that reinforces those verses. And then you have the same thing, verses 16 and 17, and then verse 18 is a proverb that reinforces those verses. So when we look at verse 15, and in your Bible it's probably sectioned off like it's a verse of poetry. In verse 15 it's again illustrating and expanding the conclusion and the mood. What is crooked cannot be made straight, or what is twisted. Crooked, not in a moral sense, but physically. What's twisted, it can't be straightened out, and what is lacking cannot be counted. In other words, if nothing's there, you can't count it, right? Count all the M&Ms in this empty bowl. There's 0. I'm done, right? This proverb, this pithy saying, this is reinforcing. And one of an Old Testament scholar says that in the ancient Near East, so the problem of those who sought wisdom, the wise men, was that they were aware of their finitude, their finiteness, but they're also aware of their inability to discover unaided the truth about life. So they're aware, man, I'm limited. I've got a limited amount of time, but I can't discover the truth about life unaided, without help. There's something that needs fixing, but we can't do anything about it. Nothing drives a handyman crazy than something that's broken that you can't fix. Or when we moved into our house, we pulled our washer and dryer out of storage, and they had been in storage for a few years and hadn't been used. And I was looking at our washer, and the tub was off. It wasn't balanced. And I was looking under it, and nothing was broken, everything. And I'm watching all these videos and trying to get this thing right and fixed. And of course, when that drum's off balance, the water just goes straight through it, because you got the drum and you got the cover, the frame around it. And so that's how I learned the drum was off balance. Because I turned the washer on, I was like, Why is the floor filling with water? So it was driving me crazy. And so I finally just like manhandled it a lot, and it did something. It works now. Not because I'm awesome at fixing things, but because I just got really angry. So it drove me crazy, though. If there's something you fix, but we can't fix it, that is the meaning here. Life under the sun, right? Now, as we move on to verses 16 and 17, he says, I said in my heart. So, talking to himself, inner dialogue, we all do it. Okay, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who are over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. In other words, I'm super smart. I've experienced it all. I've gone the farthest. I've explored wisdom and knowledge themselves, not just used them to gain life experience. And then verse 17, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceived that this also is a striving after the wind. Again, this striving after the wind is another common expression, this repeated expression is trying to catch the wind. It's trying to contain the wind. You can't do it. It slips right through your fingers. You can't get it in a jar because you open the jar and there's no more wind. There might be air, but the wind doesn't come out, so you can't do it. And he mentions here madness and folly. And so it could be that it is the distinction between wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly, because madness and folly would be kind of the opposites. And in wisdom literature, which Ecclesiastes falls under that heading, but it's not like the book of Proverbs. It kind of is its own genre, and some scholars think that this is a representative, Ecclesiastes is a representative of like a missing genre from Hebrew literature, that this is the only surviving piece of that type. We're not going to get into that. But so this is wisdom language. Madness and folly are kind of the antithesis of wisdom and knowledge. And so it could be the distinction between those, or it could be, hey, I've kept my eye on the alternatives as well. I've also seen, hey, can madness and folly help me out any? And that might be the idea here, because that is implied or stated outright in other parts of Ecclesiastes. But so it's to the extent I've searched it all, I've investigated it all. And then verse 18, for in much wisdom is vexation, frustration. We don't really use the word vexation a whole lot anymore, but frustration would be the idea there. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow or grief. In other words, the more you understand, the more you ache. There are no neat little packages and solutions to life. Bob Goff says, if anyone tries to sell you one of those, like a solution that rhymes, run away. Don't listen to them at all. And I think that that's really good advice. A lot of times we try to, especially as pastors, we try to boil things down in like these neat little phrases and these cutesy little, no, they're, and Qoheleth he's right here. No, because life is what? The more we know, the more we experience, the further we go under the sun, it only increases our frustration and our grief, because we find out that we can't fix it. We find out that purpose and a clear understanding elude us, because wisdom and knowledge dispel the illusions of life, right? If we don't think about anything deeply, which Qoheleth is, he's taking things further than most of us want to go. If we just kind of like go on with life and don't really think about it, and maybe nothing terrible happens to us, we're like, oh, this is okay, whatever. But if we really sit down and we think through it, we're like, oh, it's really easy to become a nihilist if you're just thinking about life under the sun, purely horizontal perspective. Now, for us as we've explored this kind of introduction to Qoheleth's search for meaning, search for purpose, search for understanding. What about us? And I think it's that the obvious that, okay, the answer to life is not found under the sun. And for us, I think we seem so certain now about life under the sun. And that's because most of us don't go to those extremes. If we just look around in our American kind of culture, we see so certain about we can fix everything. And if we will just do this, and this will save us. And if we just all do this, everything will be fixed. And if we just all express ourselves, and that's the highest form of good, is self-expression. If we just do that, everything will be fixed. Or if we just all rally behind a Green New Deal, everything will be fixed. Or if we all just rally around fixing the economy, everything will be fixed. Or if we just make sure that everybody has religious liberty, everything will be fixed. Or if we just make sure that we overturn Roe versus Wade, everything will be fixed. We seem so certain about life under the sun. But we need to stop and consider what Qoheleth is considering. If I just look at life under the sun, what are the real implications? What is the real conclusion? What is the honest assessment? And that's futility. That we need faith, because as humans we crave meaning and purpose, and real conclusions, not made up ones that are based on nothing or he said. That's why your kids don't like the "because I said so" answer, because you just made it up. We want something solid to put our feet on, and Qoheleth is showing us that under the sun, we don't have that. So it is increasing our motivation to seek and search out God. I hope you have enjoyed it so far. We will pick up in chapter 2 with our next session.